Okay, my name is Bob Bowman. I'm a board member of the Mountain Science and Energy Museum Association. And I also have the privilege, in quotation mark, of coordinating seminars. Occasionally I give one, we can't keep it in our desperate, but usually I try to coordinate one. This month, we're very pleased to have Professor David Allen Schmidt from Wright State University talk. This is not the first time he's spoken, at least twice. Once on the Great Miami Valley geology factors and so forth, of which he's an expert. We have it on the internet, so if you want to see it, you can learn all about that. And he also talked on the Kettering Barn Gang and the Far Hills Park Estate up in Kettering, so that's also available. And some on electric railroads in the area. So there's a variety of topics. But today, we're very pleased to have him talk about a family that has very close ties to the history of Mount Laboratory, the Monsanto Company in Dayton, and that's the Talbott family of Oakwood. Charles Thomas, who founded the Talbott Chemical Company in 1920, was acquired by Monsanto, became a leader. They had the Dayton Project in Dayton during World War II. Later, they got the contract to operate Mount Laboratory as a replacement after World War II. And the very fast playhouse at Runnymede was destroyed, which I'm sure Dave will at least show in passing because it was too hot to handle. So, so we have these stories, and rather than me go on, I'm going to have David speak, and hope everybody enjoy it. David.
Well, thank you, Bob, for that kind introduction, and thanks so much for having me out tonight. It's wonderful to be here again. One of the more colorful aspects of Oakwood's history was the presence of the Houk and Talbott families at their Runnymede estate. The Talbott family included Harold E. and Katharine Houk Talbott and their two sons, and Runnymede had its roots in the mid-1850s when Dayton lawyer George Houk purchased 30 acres of land for his parents, Adam and Katharine Houk. And this land was right here, way out in the remote countryside south of Dayton. Here's Dayton, and not a whole lot going on out here in that 1850s time frame. The Houks' fertile farmland stood on high ground to the south of Dayton and southwest of Flatiron Point, which was a well-known landmark formed by the intersection of Lebanon Pike and South Brown Street. We are looking across the area where the National Cash Register Factory Complex would later be. And Flatiron Point is that busy 5 Points intersection in Oakwood where Far Hills and Oakwood Avenue and East and West Thruston come together. So the Houks property was somewhere up in this area in the Far Hills to the south of Dayton. The Houk property included a 4-room farmhouse that stood high on a hill and had an especially scenic view of the wide Miami Valley to the north. George Houk also wisely invested in an additional 100+ acres to the south that adjoined the original 30 acres. So his land holdings expanded quite a bit, as maybe you can see if you squint your eyes looking at this 1869 map. George Houk regularly traveled from the city to help his father on the farm, and George grew so fond of the area that by 1860, he and his wife Eliza moved to his parents' home with their daughter Mariana. So here is George and Eliza Houk at Runnymede a little bit later in life. After they moved to that farm, George and Eliza had 2 more children, Thruston and Kitty. Here's Kitty. And here is Mariana, the oldest daughter. George also began expanding the farmhouse. George Houk, who was a lover of history and a lover of liberty, named the home Runnymede after the meadow along the River Thames in England, where it's said that King John signed the Magna Carta in 1215, the Great Charter of Freedom. Here is Runnymede in England, the birthplace of modern democracy. So a wonderful name for the Houk estate. Mary Ann Thruston and Kitty Houk grew up at Runnymede. Here's Kitty in the mid-1870s. Kitty attended Cooper Female Academy in downtown Dayton on First Street between Perry and Wilkinson, a rare early school for girls. And Eliam Barney of Barney and Smith had a hand in this for a while. He was not only a successful businessman, but he was also an educator. About 1876, Daisy Houk married Harry Mead, who worked with his father at Dayton's Mead Paper Company. Here is one of the early buildings that still stands in the northeastern part of downtown Dayton. There's a beautiful row of these old factory buildings. This was powered by a mill race. Water came in the back, gravity did its thing, turned overshot water wheel to provide rotary power and a little bit of electricity, and then came out the front. Harry and Daisy's children included George Houk and Lillian Mead. So keep your eye on George. We're going to see a little bit more of him. At age 15, Kitty went to boarding school at the Cleveland Female Seminary, one of the nation's early colleges for women. Here she is, about that time frame. During her boarding school days, Kitty met Harold Talbott, a student from Cincinnati, through a mutual friend in Dayton that knew both the Houks and the Talbotts. Kitty and Harry started mailing each other, maintained contact over the years. After graduating high school, Harry went to University of Cincinnati, earned an engineering degree, and became involved with construction projects for some of the various early railroads in the eastern part of the United States. She had a background in railroads. Harry also was an avid outdoorsman. He loved hunting and fishing and later playing golf. Here he is lighting up a smoke with his, maybe a shotgun in his lap. In the meantime, Kitty's brother Thruston became acquainted with Harry's sister, Lily. So, brother and sister, Kitty and Thruston Houk, developed a romance with brother and sister, Lily and Harry Talbott. On separate occasions, in 1887, brother and sister married sister and brother. Harry married Kitty, Lily and Thruston got married. Here is, going back, it's said that Harry Talbott and his sister Lily had striking, vivid blue eyes. Here are Harold and Kitty at the time of their wedding in 1887, and these shots from the family album have labeled for Harry the high-collared, blue-eyed bridegroom. After their wedding, Harry frequently continued to take up temporary residence outside of Dayton while working on railroad projects, although Kitty had an opportunity to visit him once in a while. So here they are in the Virginia mountains, Harry and Kitty and Harry's railroad crew. Harold Jr. and Daisy, the first of Harry and Kitty's two kids, were born in the late 1880s. Here's a nice picture of Kitty with her two older children. Kitty's parents, Eliza and George Houk, continued to reside at Runnymede. George Houk had continued to expand Runnymede over the years. So it went from being a little four-room farmhouse to a larger house here by about 1890. In addition to practicing law, George Houk had a political career that led to his election to the U.S. Congress in 1890. He served in the House of Representatives. George and Eliza moved to Washington, D.C. in 1891 for the start of the 52nd U.S. Congress. As his family continued to grow in the early 1890s, Harry Talbott left the railroad industry and took up business for himself as a contracting engineer. Here he is as a caricature of him and some of the kids. The family's growing. Kitty had a strong knowledge and love of music. She had a rich contralto singing voice, which is in the lower register of the female singing voices. She regularly took part in church performances and recitals in Dayton. Here's beautiful Kitty, about the early 1890s time frame. In 1894, George Houk passed away in Washington, D.C., and Eliza returned to Dayton. By then, the Talbott children started calling her with the affectionate nickname of Yanny. So she became Yanny to all the little ones. In 1895, Kitty and Harry hired a live-in nursemaid named Tedda to assist with their growing family. Tedda remained with the family for 40 years. And in the Oakwood Historical Society, we recently heard from a woman who had done some house research and lives in the house in Oakwood near the football stadium that Tedda lived in when she wasn't over at Runnymede. Tedda's help allowed Kitty to continue pursuing her musical interests. She gave regular performances in Dayton and then would go to Cincinnati to take music lessons. In June 1898, with encouragement from her family, Kitty set out for England by herself to study music over there. So Yanny helped Tedda with taking care of Kitty's children while their mother was away. During Kitty's voyage to London, she met this man, an industrialist named Francis Clerg, who had mining and paper interests in Sault Ste. Marie up in Ontario. Kitty told Clerg all about Harry's, her husband's, engineering and building experience, and this would pay off. When Kitty arrived in England, she attended a series of concerts and took singing lessons from George Henschel, a distinguished singer, pianist, composer, and conductor. When Kitty returned to New York at the end of the summer, she had an audition with an influential impresario who made her offers to have a professional singing career, but she turned away from that because she would have had to have been out of town too much from her husband and children. So she turned her back on a professional career, but she continued singing in Dayton, giving performances, was a philanthropist, supported music, and so maybe made a greater contribution to music in that role than she would have had done as a professional singer. In 1899, Francis Clerg sought out Harry Talbott and asked him to take charge of a railroad project up in Canada. Clerg was president of Algoma Steel, and he needed 20 miles of railroad track to connect a mine with the docks, shipping docks on the northeastern shore of Lake Superior. Harry took up the challenge, and under Clerg's promise of future contracts with Algoma if he succeeded. The work required Harry to spend most of 3 years around the turn of the century away from Dayton, where he was headquartered up here on a small island near Michipicoten, Ontario, which is a small settlement way out in the middle of nowhere, standing about 150 miles of Sault Ste. Marie down here. He was working in thankless, harsh, rugged environment through harsh winters, but Harry completed the project, and Clerg kept his promise and awarded Harry some lucrative projects in Sault Ste. Marie in the coming years. So with these projects, Harry Talbott started making some decent money. In Dayton, Eliza, looking cute as a button here, the 7th Talbott child, was born in 1891. So here's their growing family. Here's Harry with his piercing blue eyes, and Kitty, their oldest child, Harold Jr., on down to their next son and down to baby Eliza. In 1902, the city of Dayton awarded a contract to Harry for construction of a concrete and steel bridge over the Miami River on Main Street to replace this old iron bridge. Here is the new Main Street Bridge under construction in the winter of 1903. We're looking to the south across the river. Here's the old Steel High School. The bridge was dedicated on July 22nd, 1903 during a ceremony that drew hundreds of people. Nice colorized view looking at the bridge, Steel High School. There's Private Fair on top of his pedestal at Monument Avenue. Also in 1903, Harry took up an extensive renovation of Runnymede, adding a large music room, 3 bedrooms, and 2 bathrooms. Renovation also included wiring the house for electricity, but they didn't wire the music room because they decided it was too handsome for such utilitarian ugliness to have a bunch of cords and plugs in the music room. So that remained acoustic. Kitty and Harry planned the music room, which included room for 2 pianos and a stage with parties in mind. Over the years, they entertained there, housing birthday parties, anniversary parties, dinners, christenings, piano and singing recitals, debuts and cotillions for the Talbott daughters, weddings and performances by invited guests. And by this time, Kitty and Harry were at the top of kind of the whole social strata in the Miami Valley area. Here is a newspaper clipping that Mrs. Talbott is entertaining a duke and a duchess at Runnymede. Gatherings at Runnymede included recitations by Dayton's noted poet, Paul Laurence Dunbar. Margaret, the last of the Talbott's 9 children, was born in 1906. So this completed their family. We have Kitty and Harry Jr., Bud, who was a big guy, and 7 girls. For many years, the Olmsted firm out of Brookline, New York, provided recommendations for the landscaping at Runnymede. This plan was drawn in 1907. At the same time, the Olmsted firm was helping plan nearby Hills and Dales Park. So the Olmsted landscaping firm, very influential in the South Dayton area around this time. In 1907, Harry joined John H. Patterson, president of National Cash Register, in presenting a petition to the trustees of Van Buren Township requesting the incorporation of the village of Oakwood. After an election in which local residents voted in favor of incorporation, Montgomery County granted the petition in early 1908. So this region was part of what was then Van Buren Township. Oakwood, a pretty nice little community, and you can bet that the city people in Dayton had their eye on it for annexation, and the citizens of Oakwood said, nope, not going to do that, and they incorporated. In February of 1908, Harry Elstiner Talbott was elected mayor of the village of Oakwood after an election held at John H. Patterson's Far Hills home. After 2 days later, he was sworn in by Judge Edwin P. Matthews. During that same ceremony, Harry administered oaths of office to the other newly elected officials and council members of the village of Oakwood. The next few years, Harry engaged in the pulp and paper business, utilities, and contracting. He also kept a large hand in projects in Sault Ste. Marie for Francis Clerc, who we saw earlier. In 1902, Clerc had built this posh mansion at Sault Ste. Marie that he named Montfermier, and he moved his family there from 1909, and Harry rented the mansion from Clerc through 1913 as a summer resort for the Talbott family. So during the summers, the Talbotts would skedaddle from Dayton and go up to Sault Ste. Marie and enjoy some cooler weather and recreation up there in the summer. In 1912, the riding club, horse riding club of Dayton, took up a collection to build stables at the Dayton Country Club, which stood just to the west of Runnymede. Here's a flyer from Dayton Country Club in 1912 talking about horseback riding, the fact that stables are going up. Here's a list of the people, kind of the upper crust of Oakwood and Van Buren Township who donated money for the stables. I almost said ponied up money. Donated money for the stables. And I like this saying at the bottom, the outside of a horse is good for the inside of a man. So horseback riding, very popular in the West Oakwood and Hills and Hills Park area in that time frame. The stables at the Dayton Country Club were opened in July 12. Here's a couple of shots at the stables. If you're familiar with Dayton Country Club, there's a large parking lot next to the main building, and that's where the stables stood. Here's a newspaper article and photo about the opening of stables there. Kitty became a regular rider at the Dayton Country Club. In later years, her daughter Elsie recognized Kitty near the center of the photograph. Why, that's Mother. She always rode with her toes out like that. This image from 1913 shows Runnymede on high ground to the south of the city. So we're looking to the southwest across the developing Shantz historic neighborhood. It's just getting going there, and we can see Runnymede up at the top of the hill. Must have had a spectacular view from there of the Miami Valley. Here is a view from Runnymede looking to the north into the Miami Valley area. National Cash Register factory there. Again, this is about 1913. On March 25th of 1913, the downtown area of Dayton began flooding after several days of heavy rain. That same morning, Harry Talbott drove into downtown Dayton to see how the Main Street Bridge was holding. When Harry returned to Runnymede, several people were already there seeking shelter from the flood. Through the coming weeks, the Talbott's house at Runnymede, several hundred people who were displaced by the flood. In the city, Bud Talbott, the younger of the two sons, and Fred Patterson, John H.'s son, were credited with rescuing 162 people who were trapped by the floodwaters using only their canoe. Kitty Talbott provided assistance at one of the many shelters that were set up in the city to house refugees. Eliza, her daughter, recalled one of her mother's stories about an older couple who had been rescued from the roof of a burning house. The rescued pair had been put into a double bed at a shelter, and Mother was asked to go and quiet the old woman who kept weeping hysterically and trying to get out of bed. Mother pushed her back onto the pillow, tucked her firmly in, and scolded her. Now look here, there are many people in Dayton far worse off than you are. You should be thankful. You're dry and warm, and your husband is right here in bed beside you. That's just the trouble, shrieked the poor old lady. I never seen that old fool in my life till he floated onto my roof this morning. Although the Main Street Bridge trapped some debris, it only incurred some minor damage during the flood, so that was easily fixed. As the floodwaters subsided, Ohio Governor Cox appointed Brigadier General George H. Wood in charge of martial law in Dayton. Cox also appointed Harry Talbott with the title of colonel and placed him in charge of cleanup efforts in Dayton. So Harry got to oversee cleaning up all this mess, all this muck and debris. He brought in workers from Chicago and arranged for flat cars to travel along Dayton streetcar rails and carry away the wreckage and debris. Harry made use of NCR's fireless steam engines to haul away the debris from the flood. The Rubicon is down at Carolyn Park. If you've been there to see their flood display, you've undoubtedly seen it. Harry also made special arrangements for paying the hired workers. This was a challenge. Checks could not be cashed because the banks were closed. Paper money was not allowed to be circulated due to possible contamination and the risk of spreading disease. And so Harry arranged for $100,000 in silver to be brought from Cincinnati to Dayton to meet the payroll. Fortunately, the Dayton, Lebanon, and Cincinnati Railroad, which ran on an overland route rather than along the rivers, those other rail lines had been flooded out, so the DL&C was able to bring provisions up from Cincinnati. After Harry completed his work at Sault Ste. Marie, the Talbott family continued to take regular vacations to Ontario. In the summer after the flood, John H. Patterson and his daughter Dorothy visited the Talbots at their summer camp. Prior to the flood, Kitty had become active in the anti-suffragist movement, which had formed in the late 19th century to campaign against women's suffrage in the United States and other countries. Kitty strongly believed that politics should be left to the men, and that women had the more important role of raising children to become good citizens. Kitty continued to speak on the anti-suffrage cause well after the flood. Speaking to a group in Dayton in 1914, she said, "It is a good deal easier to make a law than it is to make a good voter. Let me tell you that." Meanwhile, Kitty had remained good friends since their childhoods with Charlotte Reeve Conover, who was a distinguished author, lecturer, and historian. She's written several crucial books on the early history of Dayton. Charlotte Reeve Conover was an ardent suffragist and also spoke on the topic in Dayton. Despite their political differences, Kitty and Charlotte remained close friends all their lives, despite being this on the suffrage movement. We could take a lesson from them. Over the years, the Talbots expanded and renovated Runnymede. Many activities in the home continued to center on the music room, and most of the Talbots' children's wedding ceremonies were held there. These ceremonies at Runnymede began in 1910 when the eldest daughter, Daisy, married the investment banker George Green. So look at the music room at Runnymede. In 1914, Yanny passed away at age 80. She was an accomplished writer, as we see in this family drawing. Here's Yanny a little later in life. In 1914, Elsie Louise Talbott married her cousin, George Houk Meade. So they were first cousins, had known each other since they were little, married. So George is the young man that we see here with Elsie's aunt. Through the teens, Harry stayed very active in business. In 1915, he formed the Dayton Metal Products Company with Charles Kettering, Edward Deeds, and Harry's son, Harold Jr. In 1917, the four men, right after the outbreak of the Great War, founded the Dayton Wright Airplane Company to address U.S. aviation needs during World War I. Orville Wright lent his name and served as a consultant to the Dayton Wright Company. Here in this photo from 1917, we see some of the people associated with Dayton Wright, including Charles Kettering, Edward Deeds, who had been commissioned as colonel, Orville Wright, looking very dapper, and Harry Talbott, Sr. Harry also had executive and board positions in a variety of other companies, including those in banking, securities, utilities, and the pulp and paper industries. As Harold Jr. remained in business in Dayton during the war years, Harry's other son, Bud, joined the U.S. Army and began distinguished military service. In 1916, Harry and Kitty began purchasing and combining tracts of farmland over in Sugar Creek Township in Greene County, just outside of the Bellbrook area. They raised sheep and registered Hereford cattle on their river farm, which by 1918 comprised over 1,000 acres. In 1918, Harry experienced heart trouble and began scaling back his business responsibilities. The following year, the Dayton Metal Products Company and Dayton Wright Airplane merged with General Motors, with the arrangements providing Harry with a large holding of GM stock. So that was worth some coin back at that time frame. After the mergers, Harold Jr. became employed by GM and Harry retired from business. After the war, Bud, the big tall one, became active in football, playing and coaching for University of Dayton and the professional Dayton Triangles football team. Bud married Elizabeth Green in 1919. Here are the 7 Talbott sisters looking very beautiful at Bud's wedding in 1919. Nelson Strobridge Talbott Jr. was born in 1920. This photograph includes John Littler Talbott, Harry's father, at age 88, Bud, the proud father, Nelson Jr., and Harry looking on, wondering where this little grandson of his came from, looking at his expression. This photograph shows the ever-growing family at Christmas in 1920. Here's Harry and Kitty, and by then, this enormous family, the photographer is probably saying, do this, do this. During the teens, Harry and Kitty began making regular visits to Florida during the winter months. In January of 1920, Harry and Kitty made their annual trip to the South. This time, their trip included a visit with friends to Havana. Eliza, their daughter, provided an anecdote about the visit to Havana by her teetotaling mother and mischievous father. In a Havana cafe, Kitty ordered a ginger ale. She heard the polite Cuban waiter ask, "This orange in?" and replied, "Yes, thank you, that would be very nice." It was. It was delicious, she said, but I began to feel so funny. Father contained himself until she had completely finished the drink. Then he told her that what the waiter had asked was, "This Gordon gin?" That same winter, Harry and Kitty planned the construction of a vacation house in Miami Beach that would be large enough to house their entire family. Fieldstone House was completed in 1921. Built around an open patio with a swimming pool in the center, the house featured large bedrooms with individual sun decks and a large deck overlooking Biscayne Bay. So a very posh house in a very posh area of Florida. Unfortunately, Harry passed away soon after completing Fieldstone House as a result of a heart attack he suffered while on a nearby golf course. So he went out of life doing what he liked to do in the outdoors, having a good time. After Harry's passing, Kitty traveled extensively and remained active in social and philanthropic organizations in the Dayton area. She continued residing at Runnymede and maintaining ownership of River Farm near Bellbrook. Kitty also remained an active horseback rider. This is Kitty at Runnymede, past 60, 6 a.m. home from a ride. Kitty's family also grew rapidly as her children continued to marry and have families of their own. Here are 6 Talbott grandkids in 1923. By the mid-1920s, most of the Talbott children had married and moved from Runnymede, although Eliza recalled an event in 1925 that brought the family back together. In 1925, suddenly our whole family was asked to be in Dayton upon a certain Sunday. We were not told why and can think of no good reason, no birthday, no anniversary, no imminent engagement. Of course we came, but even after we were all assembled, no explanations were forthcoming. Then at Sunday dinner, as soon as dessert was finished, someone said, "Look out the windows." We did. Moving slowly up the drive was a parade of 7 Chrysler cars. They were coupes of the latest 1925 model, all exactly alike except for our different initials on their doors. Harold was beaming and so excited he could hardly stand it because these were his presents to his sisters. He had become director of the Chrysler Corporation, had made a very successful investment in its stock, and was sharing the results. What a brother! Runnymede had probably never was so close to being a bedlam. The screaming must have been heard in town. Your Aunt Elsie, of course, came nearest to expressing enough gratitude. She patted, embraced, and kissed Harold and the car with her initials ETM on its door. She kicked off her shoes and got up on its shiny roof. Then naturally, we all had our pictures taken on top of the cars while Mother was yelling at us not to dent them. Kitty's sons and son-in-law, George Meade, were active polo players in the teens. Here is son-in-law George Houk, Bud Talbott, Harold Jr., and Colin Gardner, a paper company executive. So this is probably out at the Hunt Polo Club just south of Dayton. In 1927, Margaret Talbott, the youngest of the Talbott children, married the chemist Charles Allen Thomas Jr. Now this is where the plot starts to thicken a little bit. Also in 1927, Kitty Talbott arranged for the construction of the Runnymede Playhouse, which she dedicated to art, music, and sports, and placed just to the southeast of Runnymede. The playhouse stood over 2 stories tall and was the largest freestanding private hall in the United States at the time it was built. The playhouse had a high ceiling and glass roof over an area that was large enough for 1,200 women to play bridge. So here we are looking at out across the stage at a social gathering, and I see nothing but women in this picture. Box lounge areas on the second level of the playhouse overlooked the main floor and were flanked by separate dressing rooms. Here's the floor, and we're looking over in the direction of the stage. And here are some students from Harmon Elementary School just up the hill that come down to give a performance at the playhouse. The main entrance to the playhouse was through a greenhouse-like single-story conservatory. This aerial photograph includes Runnymede here at the top, the playhouse next to it. Here's Harmon School up the hill, and here's Hawthorne Hill, Orville Wright's home in the foreground. This photograph includes Kitty surrounded by her growing family at Runnymede in the mid to late 1920s. Here's the exterior of Runnymede about that same time frame. So by that time the house was huge. And a look at the dining room about that time at the home, the Runnymede mansion, the master bedroom, and another look at a different part of the music room about the late 1920s. In the 1920s, Kitty became an avid sponsor of Dayton's Westminster Choir. In 1929, she sponsored a European tour for the choir. In the early 30s, she sponsored the annual Talbot Spring Festival near Ithaca, New York. The Westminster Choir attended, as did other regional choirs. So here's an aerial view of the stadium where these musical festivals were held. Here is Kitty, where did she go? Right here with her family in the Playhouse in the early to mid 1930s, so a huge family. I'm surprised everybody's not wearing name tags so they could keep track of one another. This photo shows Kitty with her longtime chauffeur Harvey, who was a good friend of the family. And here is Harvey surrounded by 16 Talbott grandchildren in about 1925. Kitty and her family celebrated her 70th birthday in 1934. Here she is. And here's Kitty with Harold Jr. and Bud. Kitty passed away in 1935 at age 71, soon after the birth of her 35th grandchild. Upon her passing, her longtime friend Charlotte Reeve Conover penned a lengthy tribute to Kitty that was published in the Dayton Daily News. And Charlotte lived to a good ripe age. In 1936, the Talbott family gathered for Christmas dinner at Runnymede. There's a sea of Talbots in the mansion. By Kitty's passing, all 9 of the Talbott children had married and moved from Runnymede. Harry's and Kitty's children decided to demolish the Runnymede mansion because, as Eliza, their daughter, wrote, "We felt it should not survive the pair of parents that made the home complete." Runnymede was demolished in 1937 and the property remained in the hands of a real estate holding company for the Talbots that was headed by the younger son, Bud. However, the Playhouse was left standing and continued to house family and community gatherings. This photo shows the Talbott family at Christmas dinner in the Playhouse in 1938, and someone up on stage there at the end. In future years, the Playhouse would take on a very different role. In 1928, Margaret's husband, Charles Thomas, formed a partnership with fellow chemist Carol Hockwall as the Thomas and Hockwall Laboratories. Harold Jr. and Bud Talbott served on the board of Thomas and Hockwall, providing business help to the company. In 1936, Thomas and Hockwall Labs merged with the Monsanto Chemical Company. In 1943, General Leslie Groves sought Thomas's help with the Manhattan Project. Thomas decided to stay in Dayton. He didn't want to go out to Los Alamos. Groves said, fine. Thomas began developing a method for isolating polonium, a rare radioactive metal that was used as an initiator of nuclear chain reactions. Thomas decided to do the work in Dayton in the ensuing research and development of the top secret Dayton Project occurred at several sites around the city. By 1944, the Dayton Project needed additional room, and Monsanto began negotiations with the Talbott Realty Company and the Oakwood City Council for the acquisition of the Runnymede Playhouse. A lease with Talbott Realty was signed in March of 1944, which stated that the building was to be used for producing training films and would be returned to the family in good condition. In reality, the Playhouse would house continued top secret research and processing of polonium. Conversion of the Playhouse into a high security polonium processing laboratory occurred through the rest of the winter and into much of the spring of 1944. Renovations included the addition of a barbed wire fence, floodlights, and guardhouses on the exterior, and in the interior, dropping the ceiling, partitioning the large open area into several smaller rooms, and adding ductwork for heating, air conditioning, and air filtration. A portion of the former conservatory was converted to a loading dock. A local resident recalled, between big trucks rolling in and out, the floodlights and heavy-duty power lines strung all over the place was a real mess. But those were the days when you knew enough not to ask any questions. Neither were scientists in the labs aware of the overall purpose of their work, at least most of them, due to the sequestration of their activities and orders not to speak about their individual efforts. Polonium operations began at the Playhouse in early June of 1944, with shipments of polonium sent regularly from Dayton to the Manhattan Project's headquarters in Los Alamos. After the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, Japan in August of 1945, Charles Thomas gathered his staff at the Playhouse and informed them of the nature of their work. He added that they were not to share with anyone any information about their activities. In fact, Thomas himself passed away in 1982 without ever having spoken to his family about his work with the Manhattan Project. In 1946, construction began near Miamisburg on this familiar facility for Monsanto, known as the Mound Laboratory, which was named for the conspicuous Indian mound standing nearby. In late 1948, processing of polonium was transferred from the Runnymede Playhouse to the Mound Lab. By that time, the interior of the Playhouse was considered to be too contaminated by radiation to be repairable. So the Playhouse was dismantled in February of 1950. Bud Talbott built a large house near Runnymede and continued to reside there until his passing in 1952. This house still stands in West Oakwood. In early July of 1952, the Talbott family held a large reunion at Bud Talbott's home, which stood about a half-mile south of the former location of Runnymede. Over 80 members of the family attended the four-day event, which included golf and tennis games, luncheons, and dinners. A highlight of the reunion occurred on Independence Day when fireworks on Runnymede Hill, a July 4th feature, were set off from a rock that was used for several generations, dating back to the days when Mr. and Mrs. Talbott's friend arrived in carriages for the celebration. In 2017, Harry's and Kitty's great-granddaughter, Linda Carrick Thomas, published Polonium in the Playhouse, the Manhattan Project's secret chemistry work in Dayton, Ohio. And that is it for me for tonight. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, David, for an excellent and informative talk.
You're quite welcome, Bob. Thank you.
The heritage of the family of the Talbott, the Thomas family are certainly important to us. So.
Indeed.
Yeah. Anyway, are there any questions from
I
anyone?
have a compliment. This is one of the best talks I've heard in Mound ever.
Wow.
You are a professional speaker.
Thank you
did
so
a lot of
much.
research.
Thank you,
did
sir.
a really good job.
I thank you so much. I appreciate that. I'm very flattered. Miss?
I had read a book about the Russian spy George Koval working, and I'm assuming he did work at the Runnymede. He worked in Dayton for about 6 months.
Right.
His primary work area was at the warehouse. He was a health physicist, but it's very likely he would have gone there to collect samples and monitor stuff. But he's in charge of monitoring the radioactivity. And since the Runnymede place was full, he didn't work there, but he may have gone in and gathered samples and collected it, whatever information he had, and shared it with the Soviets. And became an unknown spy that was very important for their development of the weapons. As we said, we have seminars on that. We have it on YouTube, but it's a great story. And there's actually a book that just came out last year on his life, and focusing on this.
So he was probably the Playhouse?
He
but-
probably came, he wasn't stationed there, but he would
Right.
come through, they would take samples
Right.
and stuff, take them back, and he would run them and analyze them for the relative radioactivity. I mean, it's possible somebody brought him, but it's very likely, because he was inquisitive. He didn't
Right.
tell anybody, but I'm pretty sure he
Yeah.
would have figured out some way to get to see for himself.
So he was not sequestered like everybody else.
Because health physicists had to run the place. They were monitoring radioactivity. So even though they weren't doing the job, the trouble was that the people thought he was a low-level education health physicist. He had actually had 2 degrees in chemistry in the Soviet Union. He was an extremely brilliant individual. So he could gather and interpret a whole lot of that information that no one knew about. So, yes.
How long did the Main Street Bridge last?
Oh, that was replaced, holy cow. I don't recall off the top of my head. I'm thinking it was replaced in about the 20s or 30s time frame with a newer bridge. Harry had a hand in a stone quarry that stood over in Centerville where the Rod and Reel Fishing Club is, a little off the beaten path near those big water towers, and a lot of the stone came up from that and went into the bridge, but I don't know when they replaced it, but there's been 2, 3 versions of the Main Street Bridge since Harry's.
I want to point out, we have in the audience one of the few people who worked in the Dayton Project, in the Manhattan Project. We have right over here, Betty Howie Jones. She worked in the Dayton Project.
Oh, Betty. Oh.
And she told me she would drive one of the managers into the Runnymede Playhouse for breakfast. She wasn't allowed to go in, but she would stay by the pool and take a little sun time while he was doing his work stuff. But Betty is one of the very few people that were actually there. And we have more information. George Malthus, who was responsible for doing that, gave a talk about 10 or 15 years ago. It's recorded. It talks about what was done to demolish and certify that the building was removed. So we do have a lot of history on the building, but we had very little information on the family. So most of them, well, they passed away presumably in the 40s and 50s after that, or whatever, 60s.
Betty, thank you for being here. I saw you speak in Oakwood when Linda Thomas came, and it's really an honor for me to have you here tonight. Thank you.
Okay. Yes.
When Harry and
Kitty?
Kitty first had Runnymede built, about when was that?
Well, Kitty basically inherited the estate, you mean the mansion,
Right.
from her father,
Yeah, right.
George Houk, and then it gradually expanded. And then she had the Playhouse built in 1927.
But I should have meant the parents. How would people have gotten back and forth to Dayton? Was there, that was in the early 1900s?
With streetcars, I mean, they had interurban.
Did they have?
Horse and buggy, she said.
Well, in 19th century, it was horse and buggy, and then there was a horse-drawn street railroad that came up from Dayton into Oakwood and nearby in the 1870s. That operated for a while. And then in 1895, they electrified that route, and it came up to a loop at 5 points and then was extended to the
You
south.
mentioned, I think, once that he would drive into Dayton. He could have driven his own carriage, could have been driven, and eventually perhaps taken some of these other
I
modes of
assume we
transport.
had an automobile by the turn of the century.
No,
Right.
not then.
What, by 1900?
You're talking about very early on
Yes,
very
with,
early
yeah,
on, but it was
with George
horse and
Houk.
carriage.
It would have been, it would have had to have
carriage
been,
driver,
yeah, horse and buggy, yeah.
I guess.
And that would have been a long trip, taking a long time over those thankless roads back in that time. Sure.
I Googled the bridge. The bridge you showed was built 1903.
Mm-hmm.
The new bridge was built 1956.
Oh.
And then the latest bridge that was supposed to open in 2019.
Oh, okay, thank you. So,
It's been replaced like
Yeah.
3 times.
Okay, I didn't realize Harry's Bridge had lasted quite that long. He must have known what he was doing.
I have one other quick, Talbot had 9 children, right? 7 daughters. What was their religion? Did they have religion? Were they practiced? Making babies, obviously.
Well, let's see, Westminster, the West Presbyterian, I believe.
Yes.
Mhm.
So,
Mhm.
all right. No more. Thank you very much, David. We really appreciate you.
My pleasure, thank you for having me.